They were America's picture-perfect family on screen, but off-camera, a different story unfolded. In the kaleidoscope-colored world of 1970s television, the Partridge Family was more than just a sitcom, it was a cultural tidal wave. Every week, millions of viewers tuned in to watch the cheerful, musical escapades of a widowed mother and her 5 children as they crisscrossed the country in a psychedelic tour bus. To the outside world, this was the embodiment of harmony. Laughter, music, and familial love wrapped in catchy tunes and sunny smiles. But for those behind the cameras, the reality was far more fractured, more complex than the bright veneer ever let on. At the center of this spectacle was Susan Dey, barely 17, with the delicate poise of a model and the innocent charm that made her instantly magnetic. She wasn't just cast as Lori Partridge, she became her. Practically overnight, Susan was transformed from an unknown teenager into a national sweetheart. Her face was plastered on every teen magazine, her likeness mass-produced on posters, lunchboxes, and record covers. She was adored, idolized, worshipped. But with every wave of applause came a growing shadow. Fame, especially when it finds you young and unprepared, does not arrive alone. It brings with it a silence that few can understand, a kind of quiet that settles in when the lights go off and the world expects you to stay perfect. The on-screen Partridges were the definition of family unity. Behind the scenes, however, the Irie cast was a collection of individuals thrown together under relentless schedules and unyielding public scrutiny. The pressures didn't always show, but they were there, etched in the quiet fatigue between takes, in the way conversations cut short just before something real could surface. Tensions simmered just beneath the laughter. No screaming matches, no public explosions, just subtle shifts, small fractures, the kind of emotional strain that builds in silence until it can't be ignored. While the writers penned scripts about love, trust, and teamwork, the real dynamics were far less idealistic. Teenagers like Susan were living double lives, one for the cameras and another filled with confusion, exhaustion, and the unbearable weight of being everything to everyone. There was no room to falter, no permission to be unsure. She had become a symbol of purity, of composure, of the American dream. But symbols don't get to have bad days, they don't get to break down. And slowly, that burden began to change her. Even among her castmates, some older, some younger, the sense of disconnect began to grow. Personalities clashed not in dramatic bursts, but in small, quiet ways that eroded trust and intimacy. There were friendships, yes, but there were also rivalries, resentments, secrets. And Susan, at the heart of it all, was left to navigate the thin line between reality and illusion, between who she was and who the world demanded her to be. This was not the fairy tale the public believed in. It was a stage dressed as home. And as the Partridge Family soared in the ratings and became a fixture in American households, the true cost of that success was being quietly written behind closed doors on the faces of those too young to understand the price they were paying. Susan Dey was rising, yes, but so were the unspoken pressures that would shape the rest of her life. As the show's popularity soared, so did the complexities behind its creation. Behind Susan Dey's radiant smile lay battles unknown to her adoring fans. While America saw a poised, graceful teenager lighting up television screens as Lori Partridge, few knew the unbearable weight she carried just beneath the surface. Fame had come overnight, fierce and unrelenting. One day, she was a quiet 17-year-old former model with dreams of something bigger. And the next, she was a national obsession. Her face was everywhere, her image idealized, her presence worshipped. But that kind of exposure doesn't come without a cost. And for Susan, the cost came in silence. She was expected to be perfect, not just professionally, but personally. Every interview, every photo shoot, every red carpet, she was scrutinized. The world demanded that she remain innocent, flawless, and endlessly composed. But behind closed doors, the cracks began to form. The pressure to be perpetually camera-ready, to maintain the physique that fans expected, to preserve the all-American girl image, quickly turned toxic. At a time when most teenagers were discovering themselves, Susan was being dissected. by tabloids and studios alike. They didn't want the real girl behind the character, they wanted Laurie Partridge, frozen in time. And so, Susan began to shrink not just emotionally, but physically. As the expectations mounted, she developed an eating disorder that consumed her in silence. It wasn't for attention, it wasn't for vanity, it was control. In a world that had taken her name, her body, and her voice, controlling her food was the only power she had left. Day after day, she battled an invisible enemy, hiding her pain behind rehearsed smiles and polished performances. No one noticed. Or worse, no one dared ask. The industry wasn't built to nurture young stars, it was built to sell them. There were no therapists waiting backstage, no mental health check-ins, no quiet rooms to cry in. The 1970s television machine didn't have time for fragility, and so Susan swallowed it down, every doubt, every fear, every scream she never let escape. She became a master of performance, not just on screen, but off it. To fans, she was poised and radiant. To those closest, she was private and withdrawn. And to herself, she was a prisoner trapped between who she truly was and who the world refused to let her become. The more popular the show became, the lonelier she felt. Every magazine cover, every autograph line, every fan letter praising her beauty and grace felt like a mask tightening over her real face. She wasn't just performing a role, she was surviving it. And no one could see her slipping. She was Laurie Partridge. Always sweet, always lovely, always fine. But inside, the real Susan Day was screaming. She was trying to hold on to herself in a storm that showed no signs of slowing down. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, this war between identity and illusion, something unexpected began to form. A connection, a bond, a complicated relationship that would soon blur the lines between comfort and confusion, pulling Susan deeper into a story no one would see coming. Amidst these struggles, a complicated relationship began to take shape. Their on-screen sibling chemistry masked a deeper, unspoken connection. To millions of viewers, Susan Day and David Cassidy were the golden duo of the Partridge Family, the ideal big sister and heartthrob older brother, dancing through episodes in perfect sync. But behind the smiles, a storm was brewing, quiet, intense, and dangerously one-sided. While the world was busy shipping Laurie and Keith Partridge as America's dream family, Susan Day was grappling with something far more personal, feelings for David that she couldn't switch off once the cameras stopped rolling. It started innocently, stolen glances during rehearsals, quiet conversations between takes, a laugh shared a little too long. For Susan, David wasn't just her co-star, he was her safe place in a world that never let her breathe. He understood the fame, the pressure, the expectations. In those moments of connection, she felt seen in a way no one else on set could offer. And that's how it began. A subtle shift, a growing admiration, a private hope that maybe the bond they shared on screen could become something more behind the scenes. But David Cassidy didn't see her that way. Not really. In interviews, he spoke of her with brotherly fondness, describing her as sweet, reserved, almost fragile. In his eyes, Susan was the younger sister figure, the dependable co-star who kept her head down and never caused a stir. And while he admired her professionalism, he never truly recognized the emotions simmering beneath her composed surface. His attention, divided among countless adoring fans and a growing ego fueled by sudden fame, rarely landed where Susan needed it most. Still, there were moments, fleeting ones, a touch on the arm, a joke told just for her. Nights where the line between character and reality felt dangerously thin. These weren't declarations of love, but to Susan, they were enough to feed a fragile hope. She interpreted every glance, every lingering word, as a sign that maybe, just maybe, he felt it too. But he didn't. And the longer she waited for something real to develop, the more those hopes began to crack under the weight of silence. David's charm was undeniable. He was electric, effortlessly confident, always the center of attention. Susan, in contrast, was private, thoughtful, and yearning for something deeper. The more she fell for him, the more she realized how far apart they truly were. And that gap between what she wanted and what he offered slowly tore at her. She couldn't compete with the screaming girls outside the studio gates. She didn't want to. She just wanted him to see her, the real her. But he never did. The unreturned affection didn't destroy her, it haunted her. Quietly, endlessly. It became the ache that followed her home after long days of pretending. And because no one ever knew, no one ever asked, it festered in silence. She performed beside him with perfect grace, while her heart slowly fractured just out of frame. That complicated bond, rooted in friendship but tangled with longing, would shape the rest of her journey on the show. And though she never told him how she felt, the pain of not being chosen stayed with her long after the spotlight faded. This emotional turmoil would later culminate in a pivotal moment. A single night blurred the lines between fiction and reality, leaving lasting scars. By the time the Partridge Family had wrapped, Susan Dey and David Cassidy were no longer just co-stars, they were a complicated entanglement of memories, emotions, and unresolved tension. The chemistry that once made them TV royalty had long since shifted into something less charming and far more fragile. Off-camera, the years of unspoken feelings, suppressed glances, and emotional distance finally erupted, not with a bang, but with a moment of vulnerability that neither of them could ever take back. It happened quietly, away from the cameras, away from the sets. In a world where Laurie and Keith didn't exist, only Susan and David. The show was over, but the weight of everything they'd carried lingered. They had been young and famous, and their lives had been shaped by the same pressures. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was that final attempt to understand what they'd always avoided. Whatever it was, that night brought them together in a way they had never dared during the show's run. It wasn't a grand romance. It wasn't some Hollywood fairy tale. It was awkward, silent, and filled with the kind of emotional confusion that only years of repression can create. For Susan, it wasn't just physical. It was emotional validation. It was the hope that, after everything, maybe he had finally seen her. Maybe she had meant something. But whatever meaning that night held for her, it would unravel just as quickly as it had happened. Because David Cassidy wouldn't keep it private. Years later, in his autobiography, Could It Be Forever?, he recounted the moment with a detached casualness that stripped it of all nuance. He described it in vague terms, almost like a footnote, a curious incident from the past he felt entitled to share. But for Susan, it was more than a night. It was a secret, a wound, a moment she had buried deep, only to see it laid bare for the world's entertainment. She never responded publicly, not once. But her silence was thunderous. Friends say she was blindsided, humiliated, and heartbroken not because of what happened that night, but because of how easily he had discarded its meaning. He had turned a private chapter of her life into a throwaway paragraph in his story. He got to laugh about it, reflect on it, move on. She was left to live with the betrayal and the bitter reminder that the person she once trusted had reduced her to a talking point. The fallout was swift, but unspoken. Whatever remained of their friendship quietly evaporated. Any potential reconciliation, any hope of rebuilding something authentic, was shattered. Susan withdrew even further from the spotlight. Her refusal to attend reunions, her silence in interviews, her complete erasure of that part of her life, it all made sense now. That night, the one that had once offered hope, had become the very thing that solidified the distance between them. She didn't just lose David, she lost a piece of herself. And yet, the repercussions of that night would resurface years later in an unexpected way. A private moment exposed to the world reignited old wounds. For decades, Susan Dey had chosen silence, refusing to speak about the Partridge Family, refusing to revisit the emotional wreckage left behind. But all of that quiet was shattered with one calculated act. In 2007, David Cassidy released his autobiography, Could It Be Forever? And buried deep within the pages was a revelation that sent shockwaves through the industry. He casually revealed that he and Susan had once spent the night together, years after the show had ended. No context, no warning, just a confession, disguised as nostalgia, dropped into public record like it meant nothing at all. But to Susan, it meant everything. It wasn't just about the act itself, it was the violation of trust. That night had been hers too, and she had buried it for a reason. To Cassidy, it was a story, a memory that belonged to his fame, his image, his legend. But for Susan, it had been a turning point, one laced with vulnerability, confusion, and unspoken hope. By putting it into print, David didn't just open an old wound, he tore it wide open, exposing her in the most careless way possible. She hadn't given consent. She hadn't even been given a heads up. She learned about the revelation the same way everyone else did, through headlines screaming for clicks. The betrayal was staggering. After all the years of keeping her pain private, after all the effort she had made to distance herself from the chaos of the show, Cassidy had dragged her back into it without remorse. Susan didn't respond publicly. There was no counter-interview, no tell-all, no attempt to clear the air. But her silence wasn't passive. It was powerful. It spoke of a boundary that had been crossed, a line so sacred that even acknowledging the betrayal felt like giving it more oxygen. She didn't need to defend herself. She didn't need to explain why it hurt. The world could read between the lines, even if Cassidy never had. The media, of course, pounced. Talk shows joked about it. Tabloids turned it into clickbait. Fans speculated wildly about what really happened that night. And through it all, Susan stayed silent. Watching her past, one she had fought so hard to leave behind, turned into spectacle once again. But this time, it was worse. Because it wasn't just about the Partridge family anymore. It was about her dignity, her right to privacy, her right to heal without having her most painful moment reduced to a paragraph in someone else's story. And as the noise grew louder, so did the distance between her and the people she had once worked so closely with. Former cast members, unsure of where to stand, avoided the subject entirely. Some defended Cassidy. Others said nothing, but no one publicly supported her. The silence from those she had once considered family became yet another fracture, another reminder that in this industry, loyalty is fleeting and pain is often endured alone. In the wake of this betrayal, Day made a resolute decision. While others embraced nostalgia, Day chose to remain silent. As television specials, anniversary tributes, and cast reunions celebrated the legacy of the Partridge family, fans couldn't help but notice the gaping absence at every event. Susan Day was nowhere to be found. Not in interviews, not on red carpets, not even in pre-recorded messages. Her silence grew louder with every passing reunion, and it didn't take long for whispers to turn into full-blown speculation. Why was Lori Partridge missing from the picture-perfect memory everyone else seemed so eager to relive? Reunion specials came and went. Co-stars gathered with cheerful recollections, trading stories about tour buses and teenage antics, smiling for the cameras as though the decades had erased any hint of hardship. But not Susan. She declined every invitation, no matter how lucrative or high-profile. And it wasn't because she'd turned her back on the fans. It wasn't arrogance. It was something deeper, something that ran far beyond old scripts and costume fittings. For Susan, those memories weren't just television, they were trauma. They were betrayal. They were pain packaged in laughter. The media, of course, crafted their own stories. Some claimed she had grown bitter. Others suggested she had simply moved on. But the truth was far more raw. Susan Day wasn't trying to rewrite the past. She was trying to survive it. Every smiling face on that reunion stage was a reminder of what she had endured behind the scenes, of the pressure to smile when she was breaking inside, of the love that was never returned, and of the trust that had been violated in the most public way imaginable. Coming back, even for a few hours, would mean pretending, forgiving, performing. And she had already done enough of that for a lifetime. Some of her former castmates addressed her absence with carefully chosen words. A few expressed regret, noting how much they missed her. Others offered vague comments about personal reasons and moving on. But none dared speak the truth. None openly acknowledged the pain that had kept her away. Because to do that would mean confronting their own silence, their own complicity in letting her drift into the shadows while they basked in nostalgia. And yet, Susan's silence was not passive. It was her shield, her defiance. In a world obsessed with reunion and resolution, she chose peace over performance. By staying away, she reclaimed something that had been stolen from her long ago, her narrative, her choice, her voice. She didn't need applause to validate her pain. She didn't need a staged reunion to rewrite history. She needed space. And in her absence, she made the boldest statement of all. Some stories aren't meant to be retold. Some wounds don't close on cue. Some survivors choose healing over headlines. Beyond the reunions, Day sought a new path, away from the shadows of her past. Stepping away from the limelight, Day carved out a new identity. After years of silence, after walking away from the world that had shaped her and scarred her, Susan Day reemerged not as Laurie Partridge, not as the teenage idol the press had once obsessed over, but as a woman ready to take control of her story. She didn't come back with fanfare. She didn't make grand announcements. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She chose a role that was hers, alone, complex, intelligent, and unapologetically adult. When she stepped into the character of Grace Van Owen on LA Law, it wasn't just a career move. It was a declaration. Gone was the fragile girl hiding behind rehearsed smiles. In her place stood a sharp, commanding attorney, a woman with a voice, a presence, and, finally, the respect of her peers. Susan's portrayal of Grace was a masterclass in reinvention. Critics praised her nuance, her restraint, her strength, and the awards followed. A Golden Globe, an Emmy nomination. But more than that, she earned something no magazine cover could: give her credibility. Day had proved she wasn't a one-role wonder. She had depth, she had power, and she wasn't afraid to use it. But even as she soared professionally, she remained fiercely protective of her private world. There were no tell-all interviews, no red carpet scandals, no desperate attempts to cling to relevance. While others fought to stay in the headlines, Susan walked in the opposite direction, setting firm boundaries with the media and retreating into a life defined by intention, not exposure. She married. She raised a daughter. And slowly, she built a sanctuary far from the noise of the industry that had once nearly devoured her. Fame had taken much from her, but this time, she would decide what she gave. She also began lending her voice quietly, but meaningfully, to causes that mattered to her. Mental health, children's rights, the protection of young performers navigating the brutal machine of entertainment. Her advocacy wasn't performative. It was personal. She had lived the trauma, endured the silence, and now she stood as proof that escape was possible. Not just survival, but reinvention, redemption. Her public appearances were rare, her interviews even rarer. But her absence wasn't emptiness. It was presence in its purest form. She wasn't hiding. She was healing. And yet, her legacy endured. Fans still remembered Laurie Partridge. Viewers still admired Grace Van Owen. But more than anything, people respected Susan Day not just for who she had been, but for who she had become. In an industry that often eats its young and rewards only those who play the game, she had found another way. A way that demanded nothing but dignity. She had been the idol. She had been the outcast. And now, she was simply Susan. Whole, private, free. Yet, the echoes of her past would resurface one final time. In the end, silence spoke louder than words. On November 21, 2017, David Cassidy, the once unstoppable heartthrob, the teen idol who had defined a generation, took his final breath. News of his passing ricocheted across the world, unleashing a flood of tributes from fans, fellow actors, and entertainment icons. Social media lit up with photos, memories, and grief-drenched goodbyes. The world mourned not just the man, but the nostalgia he represented. For many, he had been more than a celebrity. He had been a part of their youth, a symbol of simpler times. But amid the tidal wave of emotion, one voice remained missing. Susan Day said nothing. No statement. No tweet. No quote in a magazine. Nothing. While former castmates expressed sorrow and remembered David with warmth and heartbreak, Day remained completely silent. Not because she didn't feel the weight of his death, but because for her, that weight had never been lifted in the first place. His passing wasn't just the end of a public figure, it was the final chapter in a story she had been trying to close for decades. And the silence she had once used as armor now became her last word. For some, her absence from public memorials felt cold. For others, it was deeply understood. Because when someone dies, the world often rushes to forgiveness, to tribute, to unity. But grief is not always tied to affection, and not every legacy is tidy. David Cassidy had been a central figure in Susan's life, not just as a co-star, but as a catalyst for years of emotional complexity. He had once held her heart, then broken it. He had once shared her secrets, then betrayed them. His death didn't erase that history. It merely froze it in time. And so, she chose silence. Not out of malice, not out of bitterness, but as a final act of self-preservation. In a world demanding statements and sound bites, she gave none. Because what was there to say? That she once loved him, that he had hurt her, that a lifetime of complicated feelings couldn't be summarized in a tribute post? Some stories are too fragile to survive the spotlight, even in death. And Susan knew that if she were to speak, the world would twist her words just as it had twisted her silence for so long. What remained between them was never resolved. Not on screen. Not off. It was a thread that had frayed, then snapped, and yet continued to tug at the edges of her life. And perhaps that was the truest reflection of their bond. Not a Hollywood romance or a clean ending, but a scar that shaped who she became. One that reminded her of how dangerous fame could be, of how even love could be corrupted when performed for an audience. Susan Day never tried to rewrite history. She simply refused to let others do it for her. In a business built on illusions, she chose reality. In a culture addicted to resurrection, she chose rest. Her story with David Cassidy may never have had closure, but it didn't need it. Because sometimes, silence is not absence, it is presence. And in that quiet, Susan Day's voice was finally heard. Susan Day's story serves as a poignant reminder of the unseen battles behind the scenes. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.